We want to talk about the fact this morning that worship demands surrender. And we're really going to base this on one verse in Hebrews chapter 11. This is Hebrews 11, verse 21. This is the sixth in our series that we're calling the Game Changers. And we're looking at the men and the women who are mentioned in the book of Hebrews as people of faith, and how they lived their lives of faith, and how that faithfulness to God made a difference, not just for them, but a difference in world history, and a difference to you and me today. They were game changers. They were ordinary people. Some of them were very noble and very kind and very thoughtful, and others were just plain old scalawags. This morning we're going to talk about one of those guys. We're going to talk about Jacob. No matter if it was right or if it was wrong, Jacob did everything that he ever did with great zeal. He deceived his brother Esau. He deceived his father Isaac. He worked 7 years to marry the woman he loved, and then he himself was deceived into working 7 more years. And so Jacob made himself a very hard road to walk. And in spite of his poor decisions and his wrong actions, in fact, in spite of our poor decisions and our wrong actions, we need to understand something this morning. God can transform a self-serving egotist into a surrendered servant. That's what he specializes in. He takes us from the path we find ourselves going down, quite often the wrong path, and he turns us around and changes our lives. Where we live for ourselves, we surrender and we live for the Lord. And so let's follow Jacob's path of transformation from schemer to liar to worshiper. We're going to start by meeting Jacob the schemer. We talked about Jacob some last week because as we discussed his father Isaac, one of the key things that Isaac did in the end of his life was bless Jacob and give Jacob a patriarchal blessing, the blessing of God through the years, the blessing that through his descendants God would eventually bless the whole world. And so that's where we mentioned it. We mentioned how Jacob got that blessing through deceit. He wasn't the nicest of guys. He was a schemer all his life. Do you remember what the word Jacob means? When Jacob came out of Rachel's womb, he was there with his twin brother Esau. Esau came out first. Esau was very hairy even at birth. And so they gave him the name Esau, which means hairy. So his name was Harry. And that's what he was known by. That's what he looked like. When Jacob came out, he had been wrestling in the womb with Esau. The first one out was the oldest child, and the oldest child was due extra blessings. And so he came out grabbing the heel of his older brother. And his name was Jacob, which means heel grabber. So here's 2 brothers, Harry and heel grabber. Heel grabber, by the way, became a name in subsequent generations of the people of Israel to mean something else. If you were called a heel grabber, if someone called you Jacob, they were saying you're a cheat. You're a cheat. Because that's what Jacob did. He was a schemer. We see him as that heel grabber early on in some of the story we told last week about Esau being out hunting and coming in and not having a thing. He was worn out, he was hungry, he was tired, he was smelly, and here was Jacob fixing some wonderful stew at home over the open fire. He came in famished and he said, "Brother, give me some of that stew, I'm about to die." And this really comes from Genesis chapter 25. And Jacob said, "I'll share the stew with you on one condition. You give me your birthright. You give me your inheritance. Let me have the majority of what our father has accumulated when he dies. And you can have your stew." And you know what Esau said? He said, "What good would it be for me to have an inheritance if I'm going to die?" Yeah, I'll give it away. And so they traded his inheritance for a bowl of stew. That really tells us something. It tells us that even though Esau was hungry, he wasn't thinking right. He wasn't going to die. His common sense was lacking. And because he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, he agreed to go ahead and do this. And he gave away his inheritance, which was probably about 2/3 of the estate. They basically switched it so that the older would get the lesser amount now. Well, time and time again, we see Jacob playing the odds, making deals, and trying to come out on top. If God ever crossed Jacob's mind when he was a young man, it was in the realm of how can I make a deal with him? How can I make things better for me? In fact, there was a time when Jacob was young when a ladder appeared in a vision between heaven and the earth. And there were angels ascending and descending on the ladder. And God was telling Jacob, you know, it's through one of your descendants that I'm going to be able to provide this ladder. Have you ever remembered singing that old camp song, We Are Climbing Jacob's Ladder, Soldiers of the Cross? It comes from this story. Well, listen to what Jacob said to God. He said this in Genesis 28. He tried to make a deal. He said, if God will indeed bless me and be with me, and protect me on my journey, and if he will provide food and clothing for me, and if he will allow me to return safely to my father's home, then he will be my Lord and my God. And I'll build this memorial pillar here, and everyone will remember that I have committed to present God 1/10 of everything he gives me if. Let's make a deal, God. You give me everything I need. You give me all the food and all the clothes, and you give me all the material possessions that I need. And if, then I'll say, okay, I'll let you be my God. Well, he was a deal maker, but he didn't understand who he was dealing with. God was going to be Jacob's God no matter what. It's just that Jacob didn't understand that. Now, we know that Jacob traded his inheritance, or Esau, I should say, traded his inheritance to Jacob for food. And then we also know in the story that close to their father's end of life, he wanted to bless his two boys, and he wanted to give his older boy, he wanted to give Esau this patriarchal blessing. And Jacob stole that as well. Esau was so mad that he swore he was going to kill his brother. And so, in order to save his life, Jacob ran to Laban's family. Laban was an uncle, and when he met Laban and met his family, he realized that Laban had 2 daughters. They were his cousins, Leah and Rachel. Now, we're told that Leah was pretty plain and ordinary. In fact, it depends on how you read that passage or how it's interpreted. Some of them say she had pretty eyes, as though that was the only thing about her that was pretty. Others say that her eyes were crossed, and not even her eyes were pretty. She wasn't much to look at. But the younger daughter, Rachel, she was a beauty queen. And we see that Jacob fell head over heels in love with Rachel. He went to Laban, and he said, what do I need to do to be able to work out an arrangement so I can marry Rachel? I love her. Well, Laban was pleased with this. Keep it all in the family. And he said, I'll tell you what, you work for me for 7 years, and I will let you marry Rachel. Agreed. And Jacob basically became a servant. In fact, he could have been a slave voluntarily for 7 years because he was earning the right to be able to marry this woman that he loved. Well, at the end of the 7 years, a wedding was planned. And as the bride came, she came veiled, and it was a beautiful wedding, and the ceremony was wonderful, and the dinner was great, and then it was time to retire to the honeymoon tent. And in the morning with daylight, with the veil removed, Jacob found out he hadn't married Rachel. He had married the plain-looking Leah. He was incensed, and he went right to Laban, and he said, you tricked me. How could you switch these two and make me think that I was marrying Rachel? And Laban said, hey, you know the rules. I can't marry off my younger daughter until my older daughter is married. So now that she's married, you can have Rachel, but you've got to work 7 more years for me. And guess what Jacob did? He worked 7 more years. And we're told in that passage that those 7 years working the second time just seemed like moments because he was working for love. Finally, he had Rachel. And then if we know the story, we know that neither of them could give him babies, and there was some jealousy, and so they started giving Jacob their servants. Jacob wound up with 4 wives. He wound up with Rachel, he wound up with Leah, he wound up with their 2 servants, and he wound up with 12 sons, who became the 12 tribes of Israel, by the way. And so as you look at this story, you find out that even as Jacob was a cheater, he found someone who one-upped him, and that was Laban. The cheater was cheated. His uncle was better at scheming than he was. And Jacob wound up learning that scheming and cheating is not all that it's cut out to be. But not only was Jacob a schemer, next we need to meet Jacob the Liar. Jacob the Liar. Now, the photo you see up in front of you is a photo of Robin Williams. Robin Williams, of course, the late Robin Williams, was a comedic actor that did some dramatic roles. This is a movie in which he portrayed a man called Jacob, spelled differently. Instead of Jacob, the spelling was Jakob. And the title of the movie and the reputation of the character was this: Jacob the Liar. Some of you may have seen it. It was produced in 1999. Robin Williams played a Polish Jew who lived in a Polish neighborhood in a Jewish city during the beginning of World War II. And when the Nazis came into Poland, they immediately started labeling the Jews, and they all had to wear the Star of David so they could be identified. For a while, they were allowed to stay in their hometowns, but eventually they were corralled and herded and sent to concentration camps, and there they died. But while the oppression was first starting, Jacob had been called into the commandant's office in that city. And while he was there, he overheard a radio broadcast from the BBC. And on that radio broadcast from the BBC, there was news that the Russians were within 400 kilometers of the German border. Jacob went back to tell his neighbors this news. And in fact, he saved one of his neighbor's lives because this neighbor was about to kill a very cruel and very mean German soldier who was abusing the Jewish people in the neighborhood. And Jacob was able to convince him not to do so. And so the man's life was spared. As Jacob saw the despair going on in his community, he started making up stories. And he said, I heard this on the radio, and I heard that on the radio. And the BBC says this and says that. And I heard Winston Churchill speak. And of course he hadn't. But the people had hope, and they believed in him until his lies were exposed. When Jacob's lies were exposed in this story, people turned their backs on him. And Jacob was shot, not knowing that without any idea that it was going to happen, many of the things that Jacob was making up eventually came true. And the Russians freed these Jewish people from their prison train. Now, we love stories like that. It's not a happy ending, but we love stories that have some sense of faith and morality. I need to tell you that when we look at the story of Jacob in the Scriptures, we find that there are times when things fall apart because the person we believe in is telling lies. And Jacob in the Scriptures, Jacob in Genesis, was a liar. We talked about how last week he lied to get this patriarchal blessing from his father. And from this perspective, Jacob robbed Esau of this blessing. He had already tricked him out of his inheritance, and now he robbed him of a blessing. That story is found in Genesis 27. When it came right to it, Jacob bold-facedly lied 3 times to his father Isaac. The first lie came when he dressed up like Esau to deceive his father. The second lie came when Isaac asked him if this really was Jacob, and he said yes. And then the third time came when Isaac became very suspicious because he knew the difference in his boys' voices. We have to remember that Isaac's eyes were about gone, and he relied on his sense of touch and hearing and smell. And he said, "Are you really Esau?" And Jacob said, "Yes, Father, I am." Kind of reminds me of 3 lies that an apostle told at a campfire outside of Jerusalem at a high priest's house when Jesus had been arrested and bound and already beaten and taken to the high priest for a mockery of a trial. There was one of his followers by the name of Simon Peter who followed behind and stood around the campfire while the trial was going on. 3 times, people asked him, "Aren't you one of his followers?" "No, I don't know the man." "Wait a minute. You have an accent. You come from the same region he comes from. You've got to be one of his followers." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, come on. You're one of his followers. I've seen you with him." And then Peter let it out. "Blankety blank, blank, blank. I am not his follower. I don't know him." Jesus had predicted he would do that. At that moment, a rooster crowed, which Jesus also predicted. And Peter ran away weeping. Lies don't get us into any advantageous situation. Lies dig deeper holes. Now, these 2, Jacob and Esau, battled with each other, and because of the lies, Esau swore that he was now going to kill Jacob, and for 20 years they were separated. It was 20 years before they would ever see each other again. And so Jacob was a schemer. Jacob was a liar. But ultimately, and this is where it comes into Hebrews chapter 11, ultimately, Jacob was the surrendered one. He surrendered himself to God. Let's look at Hebrews 11:21. One single verse talking about 20 chapters of a man's life in the book of Genesis. Here, all just summed up at the end of Jacob's life. In chapter 11 of Hebrews, verse 21, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on top of his staff. I'm here to tell you that Jacob would not have worshipped had he not surrendered. And you know, the worship we do on Sunday mornings or through the week can't be real unless we have surrendered ourselves. If we're still scheming, if we're still lying, if we're still trying to deal with God, it's not real worship. You see, Jacob's life changed when he met a man in the middle of the night when he was on his way back to see Esau after 20 years. Not sure if Esau was going to destroy him and his family and all that he had. And this man actually came in the middle of the night and wrestled with Jacob. We don't know who the man was. We don't know why the wrestling match started. We're just told that they wrestled all night long. And it actually seemed like Jacob had the upper hand. It looked like Jacob was maybe going to win this. Jacob was determined to win this because that's who he was. He was going to get his way. And yet, as the sun started to break and dawn started to occur, the man who came to Jacob said, "Let me go, I must leave." And Jacob said, "I'm not going to let you go until you bless me." And then, get this, with his finger touching on Jacob's leg, he wrenched his hip, threw it out of socket, and he said to him, "Your name has been Jacob, the heel catcher, Jacob, the cheat. But from now on, your name is Israel, the man of God." And from that time on, Jacob's life was changed. It was changed physically because it says he limped the rest of his life from that encounter. But it changed emotionally and spiritually because he realized he thought he was beating this man of God. And in fact, one flick of a finger and he could have been destroyed. he saw God's grace. Folks, it's important to understand that even though this story leaves more questions than it gives answers, it shows us the promise given to those who surrender themselves to God. Do you remember the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Robert Louis Stevenson wrote it. Dr. Jekyll was the kindly man. He was a doctor who was highly regarded and respected in his community. But he was also a chemist. He was also a scientist, and he had been experimenting with formulas. He discovered a formula that could actually transform a man's personality. And rather than give it to anyone else, he decided to take it himself. And what it did is it took Dr. Jekyll from that kindly, highly respected and regarded man in his community into Mr. Hyde. And Mr. Hyde was evil to the core. He thought he could control that. But unfortunately, the evil grew more and more and more, and Dr. Jekyll's kind influence became weaker and weaker and weaker. And his only decision to destroy this evil from his community was to destroy his own life. And so it ends in such a devastating way. But I'm here to tell you, even if we were to look at Jacob's life, we can see a Jekyll and Hyde situation. The opposite happens in Jacob's life. Jacob was Hyde. He was evil. He was selfish. He was greedy. He was a schemer. He was a liar. And then he surrendered to God and became a man after God's heart. He became a man who was recognized by faith. Where Jekyll had to die, we see that Jacob lived because of his surrender. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul tells us that there are some things we need to put to death. In Colossians 3:5, he said, "Put to death sinful, earthly things that lurk within you. Have nothing to do with sexual immorality, impurity, lust, and evil desires. Don't be greedy, for greed is idolatry, and it's worshiping the things of the world." In Galatians chapter 5, in verse 24, Paul told the church at Galatia, "Those who belong to Jesus Christ have nailed the passions and the desires of this sinful nature of the world to his cross, and they have been crucified there." We kill off the evil because of what Jesus has done. Romans 6, verses 6 and 7. "We know that our old sinful selves were crucified with Christ so that sin might lose its power in our lives. We are no longer slaves to sin. For when we died with Christ, we were set free from the power of sin." That power that frees us from sin is reflected in Hebrews 11, verse 21. At the end of Jacob's life, here he is, growing old, but not growing weary of God's promise. At the end of his life, here he is, dying in a foreign land. He had gone to Egypt with the rest of his family because his youngest son, Joseph, had saved them from a famine. But he held on to the promised land. And at the end of his life, God rewarded Jacob by allowing him to be a blessing to others while he was dying. Leaning on his cane, worshiping God, he blessed the sons of Joseph, even as he blessed the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, I don't know what you're struggling with, but God does. And if you're struggling to keep Mr. Hyde in his place in your life, that wickedness and that evil that sometimes sprouts up, I'm going to tell you, by yourself, it's just not going to work. We can't control Mr. Hyde. We can't do it by ourselves. It only happens when we surrender to God, when we quit trying to prove that we are so good and recognize that He is the one who saves. God isn't interested in our deals. And He's not interested in our schemes. And He's not interested in our lies. He is only interested in our obedience that comes because we recognize that we need Him. And we have to surrender to Him. God did not have to bless Jacob, but He did. And God does not need to forgive us of our sins, but He does. And that is our glory. We need to listen to the promise made to us in Psalm 46, verse 10. Cease striving and know that I am God. Quit trying to do it by yourself, because your schemes and your lies and your deals are going to get you nowhere. What makes the difference is a heart fully surrendered to God. And that heart then can truly worship. There is no genuine worship of God until there is a genuine surrender to God. And genuine surrender will not happen without genuine faith. We need to be game changers. Because Hebrews 11, verse 6 tells us this. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. Without faith, we can't please God. And we can't have faith unless there's surrender. It's not us. It's Him. And we follow Him. Now this morning, you might need to surrender your ways and your life to the one who wants to make you new and change everything. He can do it in an instant as you give yourself to Him in faith and obedience, as you make Jesus your Lord and Savior. If you've never been baptized into Christ, we invite you to experience that and to recognize the amount of love God has for you. If there's other things in your life that need to be changed and renewed, we invite you to come to the one who makes all things new. If this is your church, but you've not made a commitment to be a member and be active in the church, we invite you to do that. However God is leading you, it's up to you to make this decision. I can't be a heel grabber anymore. I can't be a schemer anymore. I can't be a liar anymore. I can't be a cheat anymore. I need to be a child of God. And it's your decision to do that now. Would you? Without faith, it is impossible to please God. It's time to please Him. And if you're ready to do that, you can come forward while we stand and while we sing this song. Let's stand together.